Hello, good morning, everyone. This is Mr. Shiau Wen-Lung from the School of Management, ZZUT. It is my pleasure to invite the Professor Alan Lee to give us a great talk about the philosophy, design, positivism, and interpretivism. Alan Lee is a well-known professor and researcher. He served on the editorial board of the MIS Quarterly for over 15 years, including a term as its editor-in-chief and the founding senior editor of the MIS Executive. His research program over 3 decades has identified lessons from the philosophy and the history of science. And in the IS, most of us learned a lot of the qualitative and the philosophy perspective from him. So let's give a big applause and welcome the Professor Alan Lee.
And in graduate school, I was surrounded by architects. So design was always a part of my education. Starting out as an engineer, I was partial to quantitative methods, including operations research. But when I entered the field of city planning, I rebelled against quantitative methods because of their shortcomings in city planning and public policy. And I ended up writing a qualitative and interpretive dissertation for my PhD. When I started out as an assistant professor in a business school, I encountered the world of business research as almost entirely positivist and quantitative. I saw that as an opportunity to help introduce qualitative and interpretive research. Because my subject matter was research methodology rather than actual business problems, I often found myself turning to philosophy. And now, some of my thoughts on philosophy. First, what is a good definition of philosophy? I will read part of this slide. Most definitions of philosophy are fairly controversial, particularly if they aim to be at all interesting or profound. The shortest definition, and it is quite a good one, is that philosophy is thinking about thinking. For me, as an information systems researcher, thinking about thinking is the thinking about thinking that information systems researchers engage in. It is necessarily reflective. So to diagram my thoughts on philosophy, here you have the observed research subjects. Here you have the scientists who observe the research subjects. And here you have the philosophers who observe the scientists. This level of observation and thinking is important. Are the scientists themselves observing and thinking about the research subjects in ways that are correct and appropriate? For instance, if the scientists are trying to reduce all human and social phenomena to numbers, is this appropriate? It is from the perspective of philosophy that such a question can be raised and answered. In a philosophical perspective, the scientists become the observed research subjects, and the philosophers become the observing scientists. Another way to look at it is this. There is the real world. Then there is scientific inquiry into the real world, conducted to produce explanations, interpretations, and designs to improve the real world. And then there is philosophical inquiry into the scientific inquiry conducted to produce better scientific inquiry into the real world, which is conducted to produce better explanations, interpretations, and designs to better improve the real world. I have always tried to take a philosophical approach in my research. This reflective way of thinking and observing has the following ramification. If we, as scientific researchers, profess that our research method is good enough to study other people, namely research subjects, then our research methods must be good enough to study ourselves. And unless we may apply our own methods to ourselves, we may not ethically apply them to others. In your own research, where you observe others, can you apply your research methods to observing yourself? If you cannot do that, then are your research methods really legitimate? Now, let me turn to some of the neglected basics of design. Here, I am building the first dimension of a two-dimensional table. In this dimension, there is research that describes or explains what exists or has existed. And separately, there is research that describes or explains how to create what does not now exist or has not yet existed. Natural and social science make up the research that describes or explains what exists or has existed. Design science makes up the research that describes or explains how to create what does not now exist or has not yet existed. I feel that the distinction between the two types of sciences is often not sufficiently appreciated. The vast majority of research in the information systems discipline used to take the natural science and social science approach, at least until the publication of Hefner et al.'s paper, Design Science Research in Information Systems, in 2004. In the second dimension, you have what the research investigates. Research has studies the physical world, and research has studies the world of people and their institutions. This 2x2 classification leads to 4 research categories. In research category 1, you have the natural sciences. In research category 2, you have the social sciences. In research category 3, you have what I call the physically oriented professions. And in research category 4, you have what I call the socially oriented professions. In this table, all the professions are design sciences. Not all disciplines neatly fit into just one cell. For instance, anthropology includes physical anthropology, which falls under research that studies the physical world. Also, industrial engineering falls under both research that studies the physical world and research that studies the world of people and their institutions. And the same can be said of civil engineering. Now, how does philosophy fit in? The discipline that observes the thinking by natural scientists is the philosophy of natural science, which is more commonly just called the philosophy of science. Philosophers of social science observe the thinking of social scientists. As for observing the thinking by experts in the physically oriented professions, it is logical to call it the philosophy of design. However, in my literature searches, I have found a field called the philosophy of technology, which I cannot distinguish from the philosophy of design. Likewise, observing the thinking by experts in the socially oriented professions can also be called the philosophy of design or the philosophy of technology, as long as technology is defined as also referring to the social and not just the physical. Here we have the design science research process model presented in the well-known article by Vaishnavi, Kushler, and Petter. I draw your attention to what it calls artifact. It is widely interpreted to mean the information technology artifact or IT artifact. In fact, examples that Vaishnavi, Kushler, and Petter give of artifact are algorithms, human-computer interfaces, and system design methodologies or languages. Here we have the design science research methodology process model presented in the highly cited paper authored by Peppers, Tudonen, Rothenberger, and Chatterjee. Just like before, for the well-known article by Vaishnavi, Kushler, and Petter, I draw your attention to what it calls artifact. Again, it is widely interpreted to mean the information technology artifact or IT artifact. My thought here is that there is nothing wrong with designing the IT artifact, but the IT artifact is not the only artifact that needs to be designed. In contrast to the IT artifact, which in this diagram is called the technology artifact, you have what Manoj Thomas, Richard Baskerville, and I call the IS artifact. The IS artifact includes not only the technology artifact, but also the social artifact and the information artifact. The social artifact includes the people, the social structure, the culture, and the organization. The information artifact refers to the instantiation of information, where the instantiation occurs through a human act, either directly, as could happen through a person's verbal or written statement, or indirectly, as could happen through a person's running of a computer program to produce a quarterly report. The overall IS artifact itself is a system made up of the technology artifact, information artifact, and social artifact, which interact with each other as subsystems. In my thoughts on design, it's not just a technology artifact that needs designing. The information artifact and the social artifact also need designing. I feel that design science research in information systems has overemphasized the design of the technology artifact and underemphasized the design of the social artifact and information artifact. Now, we move on to some of the neglected basics of positivism. Positivism, in particular, logical positivism, was a philosophy of science. Its tenets included the verifiability criterion of meaning and the analytic-synthetic dichotomy, which are concepts that I was once familiar with, but which I now consider unimportant because logical positivism is today considered discredited in the philosophy of science. However, researchers in information systems and other fields do what they describe as positivist research, where they do not define it in the same way that logical positivism does. There is no single definition of positivism. I will go over 3 of them. Orlikowski and Baruti wrote a seminal paper in 1991 that defines positivism in information systems research. According to Orlikowski and Baruti, positivist studies presume the existence of a priori fixed relationships within phenomena and serve primarily to test theory. Positivist research contains formal propositions, quantifiable measures of variables, hypothesis testing, and statistical inference. In a paper I published, also in 1991, I say that only by applying the methods of natural science, according to positivism, will social science ever be able to match the achievements of natural science in explanation, prediction, and control. Organizational researchers must try harder to make the study of organizations fit the natural science model. Positivist research involves theoretical propositions, the rules of formal logic, and the rules of hypothetical deductive logic, where theoretical propositions satisfy the requirements of falsifiability, logical consistency, relative explanatory power, and survival of empirical testing. In 2003, Lynn Dubé and Guy Paré offered a definition of positivism that would fit qualitative case studies. A positivist case study would include formal research hypotheses or propositions, measures that are qualitative or quantitative, not just theory testing, but also theory building, and a natural science perspective on validity and reliability. In my opinion, according to positivism, natural science is the ideal for other forms of research to model themselves after. This is also known as physics envy. Not required, but highly desirable, is the use of mathematics, where an alternative to mathematics is symbolic logic. Here, let me introduce some logic often associated with positivist research. I present the deductive logic of the syllogism, consisting of a major premise, minor premise, and conclusion. For example, if P is true, then Q is true. Q is true, therefore P is true. In the empirical sciences, the major premise, minor premise, and conclusion become, if the theory is true, then what it predicts to be observed or instantiated in this laboratory, field setting, or population will be true. Minor premise, what it predicts is observed or instantiated, and the conclusion is, therefore, the theory is true. Now, although this reasoning is often used, it's the fallacy of affirming the consequent, and it's not correct. Rather, the conclusion is Q's being true is consistent with P's being true, and the predictions being true is consistent with the theories being true. I consider modus tollens, as applied in empirical scientific research, to be the same as what is called hypothetical deductive logic. Hypothetical deductive logic appears in the right-hand side of the column of the modus tollens table. If what the theory predicts is indeed observed, then the theory is considered corroborated so far, but it is still subject to additional future tests. If what the theory predicts is not observed, then the theory is considered to be refuted and needs to be revised or rejected. So these have been some of the neglected basics of positivism. Now we move on to some of the neglected basics of interpretivism. Although interpretivism is often paired up with positivism for the purposes of contrast, interpretivism is not and has never been a philosophy of science, although the study of it involves philosophical readings. But it would be fair to say that in information systems, interpretivism is a way of doing research. There is no single definition of interpretivism, but I will now try to convey what I think is the essence or the basics of interpretivism. And what has been neglected or forgotten is that interpretivism focuses on meaning. Let's say you have the native, which could be a research subject in general, or in particular, a senior executive, a project manager, a customer, and so on. And you have I, the researcher, which could be a case researcher, an interviewer, a field worker, an ethnographer, and so on. The solid blue oval refers to the meaning that the native has of his or her own world, and the cross-hatched oval refers to the meaning that the researcher develops of the native's meaning. An important aspect of interpretive research has to do with how the researcher develops his or her own meaning of the native's meaning. Now I'm going to introduce the idea of text interpretation, which comes from the school of interpretive thought known as hermeneutics. I'm doing this because the idea of text interpretation can provide a model for the idea of interpretation in general. So let's say that in the year 1100 BCE, a native writes a text, such as a book of the Bible. Now, today in 2021, that native is gone, but his text survives, and I read the text. By some miracle, I actually achieve an understanding of the meaning that the native had in mind way back in 1100 BCE, even though he is not present to explain himself. So how does this miracle of text interpretation work? First, I read a verse in the book and it makes sense to me. Next, I read more verses in the book and they make sense to me too. But the next verse I read makes no sense to me at all. So either the writer was crazy when he wrote the verse, or I am misreading it. It's more likely the writer was not crazy. It's more likely that I am misreading it. So I go back and revise my meaning for an earlier verse so that in this new context, the current verse now makes sense to me. I continue reading and the next verse makes sense to me. But then the verse after that makes no sense to me at all. So I repeat the process of revising the meanings I earlier gave to the preceding verses. In this new context, the current verse makes sense to me. And because of this process of revising my earlier interpretations, the entire text has an improved meaning to me. So now let's say that I am observing a native directly. I now observe or read the native's action analogously to how I read a text. So in this slide, I place the book over the native to symbolize that I'm reading the native's action like a text. First, I observe or read an action by the native, and it makes sense to me. Next, I read more actions by the native, and they make sense to me too. But the next action I read makes no sense at all to me. So either the native was crazy when he was acting that way, or I am misreading the action. It's more likely that the native was not crazy and I am misreading the action. So I go back and revise my meaning for an earlier action. In this new context, the current action now makes sense to me. I continue reading the native's actions, and the next action makes sense to me. But the next action I read makes no sense to me at all. So I repeat the process of revising my earlier interpretations, with the result that all of the native's actions have improved meanings to me. There are some required basics in interpretivism that have been neglected. First, interpretive research is interpretive because it requires the researcher, as a human being, to interpret the meanings which another human being understands in his or her own world. Second, you, the human being, are the research instrument. Sanday wrote in 1979 in the journal Administrative Quarterly, she wrote, "The anthropologist is the main instrument of observation. Field workers learn to use themselves as the principal and most reliable instrument of observation, selection, coordination, and interpretation." And third, there is objectivity. I wrote in 2004, "Subjective meanings are objective reality." A socially constructed reality, like an organization, has an objective existence which persists beyond any particular human beings currently in touch with it. One way to operationalize interpretivism is this: for the researcher to take the position that there is no such thing as irrational behavior. Rosabeth Moss Kanter, she wrote in the classic book Men and Women of the Corporation in 1977, she wrote, "With Michel Crozier, I wanted to demonstrate that everyone is rational, that everyone within an organization, no matter how absurd or irrational their behavior seemed, was reacting to what their situation made available in such a way to preserve dignity, control, and recognition from others." If a person, the native, is behaving in a way that seems irrational to me, the researcher, then either this person thinks of him or herself as irrational, which is not likely, or I am not understanding or interpreting what this person, him, herself means in behaving this way. In interpretive research, I always go with the second choice. I am not yet understanding or interpreting what this person means yet, and I have to go back and revise my interpretation. I have yet to write a paper on how design, positivism, and interpretivism might all fit together. Instead, I'll just present to you some preliminary thoughts that I have. First, I'll touch on what future research is needed. After that, I'll speculate on how design, positivism, and interpretivism might all fit together. As for future research, I think about it in terms of the social artifact, the information artifact, and the technical artifact. Although there has already been extensive research on the social artifact, in the future, it needs to be done from a design perspective. So far, there has been little, if any, design research on the social artifact. Also, there needs to be more information systems research on the information artifact. How information systems research, in the form of design research, positivist research, and interpretive research, can investigate the information artifact is a wide open question. As for the technology artifact, there has been plenty of design research conducted on it, where it is better known as the IT artifact. What it can benefit from in the future is information systems research that explicitly considers how the technology artifact affects and is affected by the social artifact and the information artifact. Sociomateriality research has already been doing some of this. Now, how might design, positivism, and interpretivism all fit together? The most conceptually straightforward way for them to fit together is along the lines of diagnosis and prescription. To the extent that positivist and interpretive approaches are good for describing and explaining what already exists, they can be used to diagnose the situation, including the identification of possible points of intervention. And to the extent that design is relevant for envisioning what ought to be done and what ought to exist, design can be used to prescribe for a situation, including taking advantage of the possible points of intervention that positivist and interpretive approaches have earlier identified. I am not suggesting that a given study or a given research paper should include all three elements of design, positivism, and interpretivism. That would make the paper way too long. I propose that a given research effort can be divided up into separate positivist, interpretive, and design phases, where each phase generates its own paper. This means that every design effort can yield 3 publications instead of just 1. In this final slide, let me return to philosophy. Earlier, I asked the question, are the scientists themselves observing and thinking about their research subjects in ways that are correct and appropriate? For instance, if the scientists are trying to reduce all human and social phenomena to numbers, is this appropriate? It is from the perspective of philosophy that such a question can be raised and answered. Now I ask a new question. Are positivist scientists, interpretive scientists, and design scientists themselves observing and thinking about their subject matters in ways that are correct and appropriate? From a philosophical perspective, I believe that they have been neglecting the information artifact, and they have often been investigating the social artifact and technical artifact separately and not accounting for their interactive effects, with the important exception of sociomateriality researchers. What is needed is to take a systems approach to recognize and investigate the interactive effects of the information artifact, social artifact, and technical artifact. And such a research effort, which would involve both diagnosis and prescription, would bring together philosophy, design, positivism, and interpretivism. And that's the end of my presentation. Are there any questions? Are there any comments?
Thank you, Professor. I'm a professor in the University of China, and your talk is very impressive, and I think provides a very a lot of way of thinking, particularly for now our research concerning with the people-centric cyber-physics, and also for international standards development on smart city or things relevant to smart and the characteristics of smart. So we need actually respect what existed from standards, the specification already, but also we need to interpretivism thinking, understanding what is emerging things which are not existed, and then help us understanding what should be by design for the new standards, for new technology, like the record keeping. I'm leading structured managing records in structured data environment. Your talk gave me a lot of food of thought, thinking about just managing data set as authority records. We need to mapping with existing standards, but also bringing practice from bottom up into the standards development. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your comment. Thank you.
Sorry, and another question. Just
yes.
New materialism thinking. I think this is also relevant to new materialism thinking. Traditionally, we have the two universe, subject, object, and then we go to the digital world, everything go digital, go to the object, technology dominant. Now, your thinking helps us actually, we need to respect our subjects, the people. So object, digitalized object, they need to be also looked as the people, as an object. The impact, like also we now talk about metaverse, we talk about digital twin. Actually, those misunderstanding looking at this in digital transformation as object. But your talk gave us more proactive thinking about respect, the individualism, the anthropologist thinking, the human concerns. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Did you have a question or did you just want to make that comment?
Just a comment. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I want to add that a copy of my PowerPoint which contains the entire text of my remarks. Okay, I can make it available if you would like it.
Yes, I deeply appreciate.
Okay, I'll
you.
send a copy to Professor Shiau, and he can distribute it.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Deeply appreciate.
I want to emphasize to everyone that you may find my talk to be very different and unusual. That's because I am very old. I am retired. So therefore, because of my age, my old age, I take a philosophical perspective on everything. That explains my unusual perspective. Please, more questions or comments? You can ask me questions about my presentation or about other things.
Professor.
Yes.
I have one question. In your lecture, the first PPT you showed the question from theoretical question to scientific question and real world. During this process, how about the ontology how to translate to epistemology. I'm weak in English.
Could you repeat that? To translate what?
我 English very weak. 我能否用这个中文复述一下我的这个问题吗？
I try my best. You can speak a little bit of Chinese, and maybe I can translate.
Thanks. 就是说，刚才教授展示的 PPT 上面呢，它有这个哲学的问题转化成科学的问题，在这个投射到我们这个现实的问题。在这个转换的过程中呢，那种我们认识这个问题，认识这样同样一个问题的它的这种本体的是不是本体或者本体论的这个视角是不是有所转换？也就是说，它这个逐步哲学的问题逐步跟我们这个现实问题连接的过程中呢，有没有这个我们更多的认识参与进去？也就是把这个那个本真的问题呢有所异化。
哦，好，那就先这样，因为那个太长也很难。The professor, the Alan, yeah, his question is about in your talk, related
Yes.
to the philosophy and the real world. And how about the ontology and the transform from the philosophy to the physical world? Perspective from the ontologies, and how to transform from the philosophy to the real world.
Oh, I have not thought about how to introduce ontology into my presentation. My understanding of ontology is that it is assumptions about the nature of the real world. It's about the nature of being. But I think that the different ontologies that we have that exist, for example, the world is objective, the world is subjective, the world is socially constructed. Those are all different perspectives which lead to different theories. And the different theories can lead to different actions in the real world. And so that's how ontologies can be related to actions in the real world. But I did not talk about that in my presentation. I'm sorry.
Maybe next time we would like to know more and learn more from you. And before the next questions, I think there are many PhD students and junior faculty here. And I would like to ask one question then from your perspective, how to be a good professor and researcher. I think many of them would like to know.
肖教授你好，能不能我就这个问题再稍微追加一个更深入的这个认识呢？就是这三个过程，我们真实的世界和我们哲学的世界，这两个可能其真实的世界到哲学的世界这个过程中，我们对于认识问题的那个我们所讨论的那个问题的那个本真，随着我们认识的这个深入，他们这种本体和认识他们之间的这个关系是怎么样的变化，然后其哲学的方向到真实的世界的方向， 这样又是怎么样变化的？因为这是一个双向理论的一个过程，它都可能会影响到我们的这个问题的那个本身。所以我们这个我们自身的认识加入进去之后，把这个认识的问题呢，给它产生某种变化或者某种变异。
是
啊，虽然讲，
那任教授，他刚才 Alan Lee 的回答是说，有关 ontology 的，他目前其实那个议题也蛮大的，或许要留到下一次了。如果有机会，我们可能再邀请他再谈有关 ontology。他刚才有提到，就是现象部分，一般我们是转为理论化来认识跟解决我们实际上的这些的问题。那当然没有那么简单了哈，这是不是？任教授，我们暂时回导到这边，我们把那个其他的那个听众跟我们可能也会有几个问题要问他。任教授，
好的，谢谢。
The professor the professor asked many questions that related to the ontologies. I tell him that maybe it leads to the next time we invite you to talk more about the ontologies. And so I still continue my questions that how to be a good professor and the researcher. We'd like to know your perspective.
To be a good professor,
yes,
and good researcher, I follow the golden rule.
Yes.
Do unto others as you would have them do
yes.
unto you. So when I am a teacher, I ask myself,
yes.
if I were the student, what would I want the teacher to say? If I were the student, how would I want the teacher to teach?
Good.
If I am a researcher, I take the following position. Let's say I am a reviewer for a manuscript that a journal sends me. I put myself in the position of the author, and I ask, if I were the author, how would I want the reviewer to comment on my paper?
Yeah.
Of course, I would want the reviewer to be honest, but I would want the reviewer to be kind.
Yes.
Okay. Another aspect of being successful as a scholar is, like I said in my presentation, it's not enough for me to observe other people. I must also be able to observe myself in the same way I observe other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, correct. So it become like in Chinese or Western view the empathies we can take.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Let's welcome the other questions. So
I have a question. Can I read a question from the chat box?
Yeah, please.
Okay, this is from Wang Xiao, W-A-N-G Xiaoqun. This person writes, "Hi, Professor Alan Lee. I have a question. The conventional research methods rely on the philosophy and theory, whereas in this big data era, technologies such as AI can be used to conduct real-time analysis of massive data and achieve accurate prediction. Now, maybe we don't have to explain why, but understand what to do and how to guide practice. So what do you think of the impact of emerging techniques exerted on traditional research approaches? Thank you for your answer." Well, I have to say, this is a very interesting question. It's a very smart question. I must take a certain perspective in order to answer this question. I think that the big data era and the use of technology such as AI and machine learning, they are still very new. And they must exist for a longer period of time for me and for all of us to observe them and to see the actual impacts that they have over time. Only by carefully studying and observing big data and AI and its impact on society will we be able to know the real impact on how we do research. So I cannot give you an answer right away, except that we have to wait and study more. But this fits with my presentation. There are researchers observing the real world, and there are philosophers observing the researchers. The researchers must sit and wait and observe the real world of big data and AI in order to get more observations. Let me read another question. This one is from Bruce. Thank you, Professor Lee. I have some questions for you. One, is the end of numerous interpretivism, positivism actually? I don't think interpretivism or positivism have ended. I think many researchers are still doing interpretive research and positivist research. People are moving on to other types of research, but the foundations of interpretivism and positivism still motivate much research. The second question from Bruce, how to apply interpretivism to research rigorously. To answer you, I have a paper that I wrote with Jeff Hubona, published in MIS Quarterly in 2009, which was called a scientific rigor in information systems research.
Yeah.
And in that paper, I talk about how to apply the deductive logic of modus tollens in order to test interpretive research. So that paper explains how interpretivism, how interpretive research can be done rigorously. From Mei Wang, I have a question. For example, in a research on recommendation algorithm or chat box, it's easy to include IT artifacts and social theory. How can we include information artifacts specifically? Mei Wang, that is a very good question. The information artifact is what the people know. We are information systems researchers. But when was the last time we actually talked about information in our research? Therefore, we must start to begin to look at the information artifact. It has not been done that much, but it is beginning to be done. So I encourage you to start to do that. From Mei Wang, another question. Would you please give us an example or sample paper which includes information artifact as well as social technology artifacts? Yes, I wrote yes, the paper is by me, Alan Lee, Manoj Thomas, and Richard Baskerville. And it was published in ISJ, Information Systems Journal, in 2015. The complete citation for the paper is in the PowerPoint slide, and I will provide the PowerPoint slides to Professor Shiau, and he will distribute it.
Okay. So I add a little bit about the interpretive. Of course, Professor Alan Lee wrote many papers about it, very good. And another one, I would recommend the paper from another professors they published in the March Quarterly. That's the editor-in-chief of the ECIS right now, the Michael Meyer. They have tell us about the 7 principles of the interpretive. It is a good paper. Like I read many papers from the Professor Lee many times. So another questions.
May I read a question from the chat box?
Yeah, please.
Okay, this one is from Jason Wu. Could you give some comments on the mixed method boom in our IS field, especially when 2 methods with totally different philosophical stances are adopted in one study? My first comment is that it's good to see mixed methods in our field. Quantitative, qualitative, positivist, interpretive. It's good to see different methods in the same research.
Mm-hmm.
However, it's very hard to write a paper with mixed methods, because in one paper there's not enough room to talk about more than one method.
Yeah.
So what I recommend is this: to have a mixed methods research stream, but in the research stream to write individual papers that focus on just one research method. In some of the mixed methods papers that I have read, they are strong on one method and weak on another. So that's another good reason to devote a paper to just one method.
Mm-hmm.
You can still have mixed methods, but it's the overall research program which is mixed methods, not the individual paper. So those are my comments about the mixed methods boom.
Yeah, I totally agree with the professors, the Allen's. The first one is better to write by one methods. But if the research questions is very complex, then you want to use the mixed methods, I would recommend 2 things. The first one is there's one good journal. My friend Chris Well, that retired right now, he is a prior journal editor-in-chief, the Journal of the Mixed Method Research. We call it JMMR. He's very, very good. Another one is I follow the Professor Alan Lee's. Another one is the Vanquish. He published a good paper in MS Quarterly. Like the Professor Alan Lee said, maybe you will be the one method dominant over another method. You will have the one method that stronger in one and weaker in another. But at least must solve the research questions. That's my 2 suggestions. So, okay. Any other questions? Don't be shy. This we are this very hard to chat with the Professor Lee directly. So welcome the questions.
Yeah, does somebody want to chat with me? If not, I will read another question from the chat box. Yes.
Hi, Alan.
Yes.
So I'm still a little bit confused about the information artifact. So data is information artifact or technology artifact?
I consider the information artifact to be an instantiation of information by a human being. So the information artifact can be instantiated by a human being either directly or indirectly. It could be direct in what a person says, okay, or it could be indirect. For a person, for example, could run a computer program to produce a quarterly report. And the quarterly report would be an information artifact. Now, as for whether or not data itself can be an information artifact, I would have to know exactly how the data are being used. Now, Gloria, this is a new field, and if you want to define information artifact in your own way that works for your own research, you could do that. These ideas are very new. And some people, there have only been a few papers written in information systems talking about information. So the field is wide open to your ideas.
Okay, that's very encouraging to know.
Yeah.
Okay. There are many questions from the chat box. Professor Lee, would you answer the question from the chat?
Okay. This is from Ruoshu Zheng, Ruoshu Zheng. I have a question about interpretivism. I observe that people live by different ideologies. For example, atheists versus Christians. Would this affect the researcher's judgment on what makes sense as an interpretive research instrument? Would the interpretation be biased? If yes, how can we solve this? Thank you very much. Ruoshu Zheng, you ask a very good question. When I, as an interpretive researcher, when I make an interpretation, I don't call it biased. I call it based on my own values. Interpretation is based on values. Now, if the interpretation is good, then the interpretation will be able to describe future actions of the research subject that I observe. But if it doesn't, then I must revise the interpretation so that it fits the observation. So although interpretations begin with subjective values, eventually, because it must conform, it must explain the observed actions, eventually it becomes less and less biased. So this is how we can solve the problem. Even if you have different researchers beginning with very different values, eventually, because they must explain the same evidence, the interpretations will, in my opinion, converge.
Yes, good. How about the next one in the chat?
Okay. Hello, Professor. The picture you gave us shows that scientists observe ordinary people and philosophers study the research results of scientists. I think this process requires knowledge in all aspects. We're philosophers, our talents in all fields. does the application of philosophy require us to conduct interdisciplinary research? Yes, that's a very good observation. It does require interdisciplinary research or non-disciplinary research. I think as long as you have an open mind, you can do the philosophical research. Another way to do it is this. Let's say you are an expert in quantitative methods. Co-author with somebody with qualitative methods, and together you will have the interdisciplinary background. You may not in your lifetime have enough time to learn all other disciplines, but you can work with other people in a team.
Yeah, good. I think it is a great way to study some research questions.
Oh, may I read another question?
Yes.
Dear Professor Lee, do you have suggestions for junior researchers how to train our philosophical thinking when doing research? I must say that doing philosophical research is very risky. It is better to do philosophical research if you are a senior researcher. If you are a junior researcher, you can do philosophical research. Just don't do very much of it. You must have a balanced research portfolio. One or two risky papers, many medium risk papers, and one or two low risk papers. So don't do more than one philosophical paper at a time if you are a junior researcher. When you get to be old, like me, you can be much more philosophical.
And another question.
Another question.
Check back.
Okay. Hello, Professor Lee. I really appreciate this lecture. It gives me a new guideline of research thinking. As you mentioned, it might be quite hard to conclude positivist research, interpretive research, and design research in one paper. So when we design a series of researches, including 3 researchers, how to design the organic interactions among them to explain a universal and philosophical question. I think that if I'm going to give advice, I must practice what I preach. And what I practice in my own research is that in my research program, my overall research program, I have done positivist research, interpretive research, and design research, but not in one paper. Who says that you must combine all research methods in one paper? Okay, that is unrealistic. I have published positivist papers, I have published interpretive papers, and I have published design papers. And if you read my different papers, you will see that they all follow from one research program. So my answer to you is, don't try to do it all in one paper. I also believe that it's important to live a good life. And in living the good life, you will develop a good philosophy.
Mhm.
And the research will come from that.
I think it is a good advice. Yeah, not easy to put land together in a paper, but then maybe in the future. So the time is coming to the 11:15. One last question, sir. Anyone? We will finish our talk, this talk. So anyone would like to ask directly?
Yes.
No? Yeah, yes.
Professor Shiau and Professor Lee. I'm Minu Day from National Taipei University, and I really appreciate Professor Lee's inspiring talk. It reminds me when I pursued my PhD program back to 20 years ago about philosophy. I really learned a lot and appreciate. Especially you mentioned that how to be a good researcher is that how to put your thinking to others' mind. Is that how to be a good author is that you have to be a good reviewer. It reminds me that you have a paper regarding the reviewing papers back to 1995, right?
Yes.
I really appreciate it. Yeah, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you for the very kind remarks.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Professor Dai. Thank you for your comments. It is good. Okay, the time is up now, so I want to summarize this talk right now. It is our pleasure to invite Professor Ellen Lee to give up this great talk about the philosophy, design, positivism, and the interpretivism. Maybe the next time we would like to invite Professor Ellen Lee to give us more understanding about the philosophy in the arts. Especially, many the PhD student and junior faculty, they would like to know or learn more your point, how to start this type of the research in the beginning. I think it would be great and would help for them. So, any other conclusion from you, Professor Ellen Lee?
Oh, I have no other comments right now. I'm very tired.
Okay, so we are closing now. So the final step, we would like to ask the audience to open the audience. Then let us take pictures. In the meantime, I will report one number to you. There are 250 audience in your talk. It is great. So let me explain it to the whole audience. Then open the camera. So let's take a picture, then we'll close it. So Ellen Lee, please wait for a moment. We will close soon.
Okay.
麻烦各位可以看一下你们的视讯，我们可以拍一下照。我有看到了那个 Professor Ken Shiau。对 ，Hi, the Professor Penale。麻烦各位可以看一下你的视讯吗？对，我们看到了 Professor 王若斌是北方工业大学的，有福州大学的那个吴林。
谢谢肖老师，谢谢，Thank you, Professor Ellen Lee.
Yeah, Gloria， 你要不要学一下？
No, thanks. Time to limit.
Thank you.
Thank you.
袁野，可能麻烦你拍几张一下，我们要结束了。那个李平，你要开一下吗？你的名字在很上面。那个任教授也是，还有那个 Melody 刘。好，袁野，你拍了吗？
现有的都已经拍好了，肖老师。
OK， 好，很谢谢各位哈。那我们今天很难得邀请了那个 Prof Alan Lee， 好，那给我们一个很棒的讲座。好，那其实呢，他也年纪也蛮大了，然后很愿意指导我们。那我们也尽可能会邀请他哦。那如果跟他讲说也可以的话，每年大概依照他的那个状况，好，那可以跟我们华人的，特别是海峡两岸的啊，都可以给一个 talk 他的想法，因为他有很多很前沿的想法，啊，所以我们再次热烈的那个谢谢他。我有讲完，我们再鼓掌。好，来 Professor Alan Lee，I told him that we are very happy to hear your talk here, and we also would like to invite you if your time is available, maybe annually, just one time a year, can give up your thought, your experience in not only in the teaching, in the research, and maybe your life value, like you said many times, your personal thought. I think it would be very great for the junior faculty and the PhD students. So finally, let's give a big applause to the Professor Lee. Then we'll end this our section. 好，我们鼓掌，谢谢那个 Professor Lee.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you,
Well, thank
Professor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Lee. Thank you very much. I will send you an email. And good night.
Okay, good night.
See you.
好，也谢谢大家。我们希望有机会下一次邀请大家，可以再多听听 Professor Lee 的讲座。那我们后面其实还有几场讲座，如果各位有兴趣的话，也可以再继续听我们一系列的讲座。好，也谢谢各位。
Thank you so much.
谢谢肖老师的主持。
谢谢，好，拜拜啦。
感谢肖老师。
Thank you. Thank you so much.